In this video, we're going to talk about the internal work that you need to do before you begin external communication. And the starting point is to know your audience. Choose any issue at all of interest to you. And then think about how many audiences do you have for that issue. You need to listen to each of them. What does that audience need? What do they want? These are things you need to know. What is most important to them? What are they least likely to care about? And what do you want your audience to think, to learn, or to assume? Who is your audience? Who needs to hear your message? Who has influence over your target audience? Who needs to be moved to action so your goals will be met? And who has the greatest impact on the outcome of your campaign efforts? If you can ask and answer these questions, you'll know who your audience is. Start where your audience is. This advice is simple, and it's simple to follow, but only if you know who your audience is. To help you know your audience, we're going to look at 4 topics. First, we're going to consider some audience basics. Then we're going to look at risk perceptions. Third, we'll be considering psychographic information. And finally, we'll consider engaging the audience. Consider what a credible speaker can do. Some people are more difficult to persuade or to communicate with, and so there are some factors to consider about your audience. What's their past experience with the risk? And what's their past experience with the information source? Do they have any prior knowledge of the topic? How knowledgeable are they about the risk? What is their stake with the risk? Does the health of the individual or their family come into play? And what are the attitudes that the audience has toward the organization that's considered responsible for the risk? Consider how different your message might be for these different audiences: government, industry, academia and research institutions, media, consumers and consumer organizations, or the general public, where you have a wide variety of family situations, locations, professions, physical differences, cultural differences, generational differences, language, and different histories with this risk. So make sure as you begin, you have some basic information about your audience. Next, we'll consider risk perceptions. There are many outrage factors that affect how a person perceives risk and how they judge its acceptability. Outrage increases with the catastrophic potential of a risk. It decreases the more familiar and understandable or controllable the risk is perceived to be. Voluntary exposures evoke less outrage, but effects on children or particularly scary manifestations of the effects can increase the outrage. If we know the victim or if it's a identifiable human being, outrage will be greater than it is with the statistical risk. If the risk is something people dread, outrage will be greater. If people trust your institution, outrage will be reduced. Media attention and accident history have the ability to increase outrage. If the risk is perceived to be fair or equitable, there will be less outrage. If the risk comes with significant benefits, the outrage is less. Reversible consequences result in less outrage, and the origin of the risk can matter as well. If it is perceived as a human failure, the outrage is greater than it is for an act of God. So these are some things that you should understand about your risk before you begin to interact with the audience. Here are some more questions that will affect the audience's perception of the risk. Can we see the risk? Do scientists know a great deal about the risk? Do they know anything about it at all? Do the people exposed to the risk know about the risk? Are the risk effects immediate or are they delayed? Are they chronic or catastrophic? And can we control our exposure to the risk? The level of outrage about a risk is affected by questions like, is this risk shared by many people or is it a burden only to a few individuals? Does the risk pose a danger to future generations? Is the risk increasing or decreasing? Are we voluntarily exposing ourselves to the risk? Is this a risk that people really dread on the level of an instantaneous response? Let's talk about psychographic information. Psychographics is a system for measuring consumers' beliefs, opinions, and interests. It's kind of like demographics, but instead of counting age and gender, race, income, education, things like that, it counts psychological information, things like opinions on issues, religious beliefs, musical taste, personality traits, and so on. What do you know about the self-esteem of your audiences? These are feelings of self-worth based primarily on reflected appraisals. Feelings of efficacy based on observations of the effects of one's own actions on their circumstances. So if people feel like there are things that they can do to protect themselves, they're going to have a higher sense of self-esteem than they would if they feel like there's very little that they can do to protect themselves from the risk issue of interest. So before you go out and begin to speak to audiences, think about what groups in your area tend to have high self-esteem. What groups in your area are going to have low self-esteem? Groups who feel empowered to help themselves are going to respond differently from those who feel more helpless. Risk often deals with people's health, safety, or well-being in some way, and research shows self-esteem affects how we think about health. Whether people use birth control or would do a breast self-examination, whether they exercise or not, these things are all highly correlated with their self-esteem. In general, people's willingness to take effective action is closely related to their self-esteem. Involvement is another psychographic factor. It reflects the level of concern the audience has for the issue. Does the audience see how the issue affects them? We're going to talk about 4 kinds of involvement: value relevant, outcome relevant, impression relevant, and ego relevant involvement. An audience's values are relevant to risk communication because it's difficult to persuade people if the issue goes against their values, especially if they're highly ingrained values. So if you want these audiences to listen to or to read your message, it must be written to reflect their values. You can involve an audience if they feel like the outcome is relevant. You can persuade people if they believe it's in their best interest to be persuaded. But you have to persuade the audience the topic is in their best interest. And this best interest has to be communicated effectively to the audience. People are going to have an impression of the issue or the risk, and their impression can inhibit their attitude in general, and especially it can become a block to attitude changes. So you have to show the audience the actions you want them to take are not silly. You have to make them believe people will not think less of them. Ego involvement is especially important. It's really difficult to persuade people who have an ego attachment to an issue. So when a message threatens their ego, they get defensive. And this defensiveness is going to lead them to derogate the source. And the source is going to be you. So be especially careful to stay away from anything that insults people, especially people who have an ego attachment to the issue. Anxiety about an issue is another psychographic factor that's important to understand. When there is a high-risk situation accompanied by low efficacy, where people have very few options for dealing with the risk on their own, this increases anxiety. Now, anxious people are motivated to seek information, but the anxiety gets in their way to process that information. So understanding the anxiety level of your audience can be very important to crafting effective risk communication messages. Fear and trust are important psychographic factors, and they work in the opposite directions. Let's start with fear. It's rapidly acquired, It's very slow to extinguish. It lasts a long time, and it's easily reestablished. Trust, on the other hand, is just the opposite. It's slowly acquired, and it can be rapidly extinguished, and is very difficult to reestablish. So fear and trust are two adaptive survival processes that are important to understand if you're going to communicate effectively with your audience. Let's think about how people adjust to risk. Reactions change as risk increases. Notice the horizontal axis here, where we go from low perceived risk to high perceived risk. When the risk is low, people are willing to accept it. As the risk begins to grow, people begin to fear it. If the risk grows even more, there can be a period of denial where people don't want to look at or even consider the risk. And if the risk continues to grow in its perception, this can lead to panic. Risks that occur frequently are met with acceptance. It's only those very rare risks that are met with panic. So panic itself is very rare. To be a good risk communicator, you have to be willing to scare people. Fear is a useful response, so you have to be willing to let it happen. Fear is our natural reaction in a crisis. It's automatic. It comes early in the process. It's usually temporary. And it often results in a small overreaction to the situation, so it may need some guidance. Fear serves as a rehearsal for taking effective action, and it can be useful in reducing later overreactions. When we learn about a new, potentially serious risk, our initial reaction is often to overreact. Overreaction causes us to pause and to think about things, and we often become hypervigilant and aware of the hazard or the risk. It's during this time that we personalize the risk, and that can result in us taking extra precautions that are probably unnecessary or at least premature. A few minutes ago, I mentioned denial as a response to risk. Heightened fear can lead to denial. Denial is less common than fear, but it's a lot more dangerous than fear, because in a state of denial, people will refuse to take effective action. But denial is more common than panic. To reduce denial, what we want to do is legitimize the fear. Let people know that it's a normal reaction to the situation that we're in. But we want to help them to take effective action, give them something to do. So if you can present people with a decision, give them a range of actions to choose from for themselves and their family, this can be effective in reducing the fear and the denial. Panic is a sudden, strong feeling of fear that prevents us from thinking clearly or taking reasonable actions. And while panicky feelings are common, panic itself is really quite rare. Here's some psychographic information for you. Let's consider the response to the anthrax scare in the United States in 2001. Shortly after the 9/11 event, letters were found mailed to public authorities that had anthrax in them. So in 3 affected cities, 1% of the population bought gas masks. 5% bought prescription antibiotics, but 80% of these people never took the drugs. 98% of the population opened their mail as usual, and 3% of the population consulted a doctor for anxiety. So on balance, the response was pretty normal. As a risk communicator, you have to be careful not to fear fear or to panic over the possibility of a panic. If you do these things, it can lead to you withholding information from people, and this could be worse than any kind of fear reaction. Information is what people need in a crisis situation. Or it could lead you to over-assure people, and this could be deadly in some instances, because it could make people think that taking effective action to protect themselves from the risk isn't necessary. It turns out that most people can cope with their fear and manage their fear. So once again, as a risk communicator, don't be afraid of fear and don't panic over the possibility of a panic. So what can we do to help? Anxious and fearful people, first and foremost, need to feel efficacy. There are two kinds of efficacy. Self-efficacy means you can do the action. There are things that you can do to lower your risk. And response efficacy means, and the thing that you can do will work. It will reduce your risk. When people are anxious and fearful, they need sensitive and simply put information that they can process easily. So that means don't give complicated directions, no long and rambling kinds of instructions. But anxious people need specific instructions. 1, 2, 3. Take these 3 steps to protect yourself and your family. Culture is another psychographic factor. It's particularly important to understand where your communities and your audiences are on the individualism-collectivism continuum. Collectivist cultures tend to value harmony, concern for others, and the goals of the group are more important than the goals of the individual. But in individualistic cultures, people tend to value independence and the goals of the individual rather than the goals of the group. So you need to pay attention to the culture of the specific community and the audiences you're dealing with. Don't rely on stereotypes. Make sure you get some information so that you know exactly what you're up against. If we were face to face, this would be time for some discussion. I'd like to know, is this psychographic profiling reasonable? Do you develop any psychographic profiles for your audiences? Who does that, or who would do that? A lot of experts feel like they can just wing it with an audience, that the things that they know will carry them through, but it's the things that they don't know about their audience that can come back and hurt them. Let's talk about some rules for engaging the audience. Let's start off by considering an audience report card. Think about how you or your organization do with respect to these activities, and what kind of grade would you give yourself for this? Do you accept and involve the public as a legitimate partner? Do you plan carefully and then evaluate your efforts? Do you listen to the audience's specific concerns? Are you always open, honest, and frank? Do you coordinate and collaborate with other credible sources? Do you meet the needs of the media? Do you speak clearly and with compassion? We'd like to think we're getting A's and B's, but experience suggests there are a lot of C's and D's and even some F's when it comes to this audience report card. The first rule for engaging the public is to accept and involve the public as a legitimate partner. People expect the opportunity to participate in decisions that affect their lives in a democracy. So you have to demonstrate respect for the public, because the public's going to hold you accountable whether you're a public servant or not. The trick is how to involve them. Here are some tips to remember. Once you step on the platform, you share responsibility for the problem. So don't attempt to diffuse their concern. Don't tell people not to worry or that you wouldn't worry. And don't try to preempt any actions that they're planning to take. What you want to do is to help and inform them. Never try to manipulate your audience. People want the opportunity to participate, but they're not necessarily going to do so. People who do often have an agenda, and agendas are sometimes a good thing. So if there's an agenda out there, make sure you can become aware of it. The second thing you want to do when engaging the public is to plan carefully and then to evaluate your efforts. Planning carefully means you got to begin with clear and explicit communication objectives. Evaluate your information ahead of time. Be aware of the weaknesses in your data and in your knowledge. You want to address the concerns of subgroups in the audience, but don't pander to the subgroups. Just recognize different publics and adapt your strategies to each of these publics. Pretest your message when possible, and know that it's always possible to pretest your message. Use your neighbors, use your kids, use your spouse, use your coworkers, but pre-test. So here are a couple of tips. Prepare 2 or 3 talking points, word them simply, and learn them cold. Pre-test your message with typical people, not activists or community leaders, and make sure you always pre-test before going on TV. Beware of small, seemingly unimportant meetings. There are no unimportant meetings. And if you do find yourself in a meeting, try not to say we need to do more study because it sounds evasive to the public. Learn how to talk about uncertainty. Rule number 3 is to listen to the audience's specific concerns. That means you have to listen to the audience because that's the way you're going to identify their concerns. Don't assume what people know, think, or want done before you've heard from them. This is a way of recognizing and honoring people's emotions. You also have to recognize their concern for fairness, their trust in your organization, your credibility, your competence, their ability to control the situation, you caring about them, and the morality of the actions that you are proposing that they take. Make sure that you never walk into a meeting with no preparation. Arrive early, mingle with people, get an idea who's there, find out what people are thinking, listen to people, talk to people. Experts, especially physicians and academics, don't live ordinary lives, so you need to stay in touch with those ordinary lives. This is about honoring emotions. That means respecting people's emotions. You don't have to validate their emotions, but you need to respect them. People are going to look for meaning in what you say, in how you say it, how you dress, how you stand, how you gesture. People are going to read in all kinds of concerns, myths, and meanings that you never intended. Remember, people come to the table with their prior life experience, their beliefs, their personal knowledge and values, and this is why it's important to find out these things and these concerns before you interact with your audience. Be open, honest, and frank with your audiences. Trust and credibility are your most important assets. Once you lose trust, it's difficult to regain. Physicians have higher credibility with an audience. Government agencies, lawyers, these tend to have less credibility with the audience. Admit the uncertainty. Admit any mistakes that you've made, and don't speculate or distort the level of risk. Some occupations may have higher credibility than others, but don't count on it in a pinch. As for discussing worst-case scenarios, it may be a good strategy, but only if the topic arises naturally. You shouldn't be the one to bring up a worst-case scenario. Rule 5 in engaging with the public is to coordinate and collaborate with other credible sources. You need to develop relationships with other sources of risk information, and preferably in advance of your communications. Coordinate your messages so the public hears a consistent interpretation. Avoid public disagreements, but acknowledge uncertainty and differences of opinion. Try never to be blindsided by new information. Monitor the public media on the issue as well as technical sources. If others who are going to be at a meeting do not coordinate their message with yours, don't argue with them. Be respectful to the other party, state your position clearly and your reasons for your position, but let them take the heat for the inconsistency, not you. And if you're not prepared for the meeting, do not go unless you must. It's important to meet the needs of the media. You need to acknowledge that media have a legitimate role and a need for information, but you also need to understand the behavior of the media's representatives. They need simplicity. They are looking for conflict. They want a hook for their stories. So if you can provide that for them, it's going to give you more control over the content. Prepare media materials in advance. Make sure you're accessible to the media. And establish relationships with individual media representatives in advance. The media are usually not out to get you, they're out to get a story. So don't be the story. Media materials should be sufficient for a reporter to write the whole story. Supply a hook that they can use if you can. And remember, if a reporter uses you as a reliable source when they need one, they're more likely to come to you when you need to get the word out. Rule 7 for engagement with the public is to speak clearly and with compassion. Avoid technical language and jargon. Be sensitive to local norms and expectations in language and dress and all of that. Use concrete examples, or at least use vivid metaphors. Be sure the examples are relevant and simple, and make sure that they respond to people's emotions, acknowledge the tragedy and the anxiety that people are feeling. This is not the time to challenge core community attitudes and beliefs. Remember that people respond to stories much better than they do to theories or facts, so use stories wherever you can. If you can use universal examples rather than borrowed experiences, that can be more effective. And watch your body language. It's 90% of communication. Make sure your body language is consistent with your message. Responding to emotional outbursts can be a challenge, so what you want to do is begin by conveying empathy for the person's response. By the same token, it's all right to express some skepticism over what they say, especially if it's unfounded. If you're going to restate a problem in objective terms without the emotion, you're going to have problems. It's the emotion that matters to people. So be sure that you never cut off anyone, speak with them gently, and if you need to regain control, do it by restating the concerns that were expressed. We started with this report card. Would you like to change any of your grades based on anything that you've heard? Here are a couple of takeaway points. No two audiences are alike. Think about who you are communicating with. Assess the target audience's perceptions, their knowledge, and their experience with risk, and do this professionally if at all possible. Analyze the audience's characteristic and know how high their self-esteem is. Understand their level of anxiety and know what kind of involvement they are inclined to have. This lecture has been prepared based on materials provided by the National Center for Food Protection and Defense.